well, might be
Yeah.
interesting.
Okay, so welcome to I think the third cover seminar for the year. I'm not going to give a very long formal introduction to Martin because I think everyone knows him. And if you don't, you can just Google him. But I will start with a little story because we're talking about commons. And one of the first times I remember meeting Martin was when I got interviewed for a PhD studentship at Leicester in 2004. And I stupidly asked in the middle of the interview, what's critical management studies? And Martin very sensibly could have said, you idiot, why are you asking me a daft question in your interview? But no, he instead said, I don't know. What do you want it to be? Make it that. And I think in a small way, that kind of is a nice summary of Martin's kind of engagement where, yes, he obviously couldn't give an answer, but by keeping open a space for what can you do with this space? What can you make something more interesting? That's where you get emergence of things like forms of commoning and opening up spaces. So yeah, that's my sort of short introduction to Martin as a nice story. And I'll just hand it over to you and you will do something awesome.
Thank you very much. I won't do anything awesome. Lower their expectations rather than raise them, please, Stephen. This is going to be an hour of turgid nonsense that you've probably heard before. I'll try and speak for, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes or so. And then we can have some chat about things. Thanks ever so much to everyone for turning up. It's lovely to see a full screen. We're used to being on Zoom. It's just like two people, it's all a bit sad. Shall I try and share my thing, if I can do this? This is the trickiest part of the entire presentation, obviously. Let's see if that happens. Okay, can you see that? Yes, good. Let's see if this slideshow from beginning, can you see that? Just the title page. Yeah, all good?
Yeah.
Excellent. Right, now it probably won't move, so let's see if it will. So University Without Walls, or Can We Be Wandering Academics? So I'm going to start with my dad. This is an odd thing. I've not really thought, I was going to say it's a terrible thing to say. I've not really thought a lot about my dad. Well, I have thought a lot about my dad, obviously, but not necessarily in the context of my academic work. My dad died in 2016 and spent most of his career as an extramural academic at the University of Birmingham. That term extramural is kind of rather an antiquated one now, just literally means outside the walls. And my dad spent most of his life, he never worked in a regular department. He was kind of a political geographer of some kind. But he always worked in adult education, initially in the Workers' Education Association, and then as an extramural lecturer at Birmingham for, I don't know, probably about 30 years, something like that. And it was a kind of an odd thing when I started to think about him, about his job a couple of years ago, because he was kind of loosely tied to the university in some ways. He really believed in the idea of the university. He was very keen on academic debate and argument and, writing his books and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, he wasn't really part of its structures. He wasn't part of its regular departments. He never taught undergraduates or postgraduates or supervised a PhD student or anything like that. He just spent all his time organizing and teaching courses to adults in a wide variety of the areas around the North Midlands. So, my kind of childhood memories are of him not coming back till quite late because he'd been teaching a class in Shrewsbury Library or something like that. Or sometimes during half terms, he'd take me with him to put leaflets in various community centres about the courses that were offered by the university. And these were courses in things like local history or stuff about, I don't know, the politics of the Soviet Union or bird watching or, the fields of Staffordshire or something, whatever it might be, a series of kind of interesting courses. And most of these courses were unaccredited and they were taught to mostly middle-class adults for a very minimal fee. I mean, basically the fee was covering the tea and biscuits. Yeah, something along those lines. The reason I started with my dad is because there's something interesting there about the way in which his idea of the university was kind of strangely distributed, was wandering. And through most of his life, he was kind of committed to this idea of adult education, of a particular form of knowledge that was aimed at not, you know, the 18-year-old student, but at grown-ups at various stages of their life. And many of the grown-ups that he taught became kind of friends and family friends and stuff like that. So an odd thing then happened to me. Oh no, I've just jumped to forget that last sentence. there's another slide. Effectively, what's happened, I think, in between my dad's career, which sort of begins in the 1960s, I suppose, something like that, and mine, is the construction of walls around the university, the mainstreaming of adult education. Virtually all of the extramural departments are gone now. I think that Oxford still has some extramural provision, but there's very little of it. And most of the funding for mature learners has effectively been cut. Which is kind of enclosed higher education. It means that higher education is now largely about the delivery of credit-bearing modules with assessment in exchange for cash. Yeah, so learning takes place within the institutions and is no longer distributed in that sense. Of course, there's a whole bunch of other ways in which we could talk about these walls too, about, you know, the ref and grant capture and citations and paywalls and all the rest of it. But it seems to me that, you know, broadly, we can talk about this idea of the enclosure of the university, that the universities in the UK have become more and more walled off from the cities that they're part of. Effectively, you have to pay your tithe to go in, despite the fact that they've kind of, you know, grown in terms of student numbers and so on. I think I'd argue that they're actually less distributed in spatial and temporal terms than they were previously.
Hey, Martin, just a quick thing. Your slides aren't moving if you've been moving slides.
Oh, I see. So can you see one that says walls?
No, we see like this, like the first slide.
Oh, okay. Hang on a second. So you never saw the picture of my dad?
Well, we can see it very, very small in the like the left-hand column.
Oh, okay.
You have the you don't have the presentation view on, Martin. So that's the issue. We see the editing part, but
let me see. Let me stop sharing and then I'll try and do this again. So for some reason, okay, it's showing up twice on there. All right, let me see if I can, just bear with me a second. Been talking about the importance of education. I can't even manage to do this, can I? Hopeless.
Well, I mean, if there's at least one text mess up, then is it really a university event?
You're right, yeah. It would be kind of disappointing, wouldn't it? Yeah, that's right. What I might do, if I can't manage this, is just talk. Could do that, couldn't I? That would be okay too.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'll do that. Yeah, perhaps I'll do that. I'll just talk because I know what's on these PowerPoints. I can always send you the PowerPoints if you want anyway, couldn't I? Okay. Oh, I've gone all strange now. Can you see an odd? All right, that's better, isn't it? Okay, right. I'm just gonna talk. That'll be fine. Otherwise I'll spend an enormous amount of time trying to find these PowerPoints again. So that sense of the enclosure of the university is something that seems to me to be a real danger if we want to think about ways in which the institution could be opened up to a much wider variety of ways of thinking about research, teaching, impact, engagement, blah, 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 all those kinds of things. Because effectively what's happening at present is that universities are becoming, and I'm using this word in quite a specific sense, more and more corporate, in the sense that they are bodies of, usually bodies of buildings and people that are effectively exclusive from the context that they are part of. In a sense, there's a curious echo here, of course, of this idea of the monastery, of the kind of the ways in which the medieval university walled itself away from the city. And I think there's something going on here also about the almost the kind of the end of the idea of the kind of the mendicant, of a scholar who might travel in order to distribute forms of knowledge and expertise in a variety of different ways. That effectively the scholars are now gathered within the academy and you pay cash to go and see them. Now, an odd thing happened to me when I started at the University of Bristol, which then sort of led to this sort of echo about my dad and his experiences. After I started here in 2018, one of the attractions of Bristol was because there were so many interesting things happening in the city, lots and lots of green and lefty initiatives, co-ops and local money, and all sorts of the interesting economic stuff that I've been fascinated with for quite a long time. And I was I wasn't offered, I applied for the leadership of a new research unit that was being set up that was going to be called the Civic University Research Unit, and was associated with the development of a new campus away from the Clifton area of the city, which is the kind of the most affluent, the whitest, the most privileged, etc., and down towards a campus in the station, near the station, just east of the station, which was going to be much closer to many of the deprived areas of East and South Bristol. So this was very often articulated in a variety of ways, but one of them was the idea of the university coming down from the hill. For those of you who visited Bristol, that there's a long street called Park Street that you walk up, and at the top of it is the Wills Tower, the big Batman Tower built by fags and slaves and all the rest of it. And there's the kind of real symbolism at the top of the university at the top of the hill. The idea that the university was going to come down was then kind of became part of a narrative, and part of a narrative which was underpinned by this notion of the civic university, which the previous vice chancellor was pushing heavily. This was a particular articulation that was kind of first put forward by John Goddard at Newcastle University to talk about the way that British universities, particularly the kind of the old urban civics, needed to restore trust, needed to engage with the city in a variety of different ways that they hadn't done previously. So what the university started to do was to talk about this new campus, Temple Quarter, just next to Temple Mead Station, in terms of it being a civic campus, a campus that was open to the city, that would have a nursery, that would have a ground floor that was open to a whole variety of community groups, cafes open to the general public, maybe sharing office space with a variety of third sector organizations, and so on. That was the kind of the idea. And at that time, when this Civic University Research Unit came up, I expressed an interest in doing something with this lot, but suggested that it would be better to talk about it in terms of alternative economy. Basically, I tried to describe what the institute should be in my own terms, and ended up with this thing called the Inclusive Economy Initiative. And the idea there was that, I was going to try and get the university to work alongside co-ops and mutuals, employee ownership organizations, and local money and various activists and the city council, and, kind of to try to be a certain sort of a catalyst or a glue or something like that to translate between the university and a whole bunch of interesting people doing great things in the city. Now, effectively, what happened as a result of that was that I spent an awful lot of time outside the university in between sort of 2019, when the thing, when it was kind of late 2018 when all this started, and then COVID, when everything was driven online. my partner used to joke about me being sort of fat man on a bicycle, that I just used to cycle, spend entire days cycling around cycling around the city, having cake in various different places with interesting people and trying to incubate different sorts of projects and things like that. This was possible because of the excitement about the Temple Quarter project. I was brought out for 50% of my time. So effectively I had the time to go and do these kinds of things. And it was fascinating, really interesting. I've been an academic for a long time, but most of my academic practice has been about working within the institution, about being director of research or head of department or whatever, and focusing on how to cultivate and protect critical work within all that kind of stuff. But suddenly I was outside trying to talk to a variety of activists about green transport, about food production, about anarchist bookshops, whatever, some bicycle co-op, whatever it was, a whole bunch of interesting things that I was having conversations about. And what I took from that, leaving aside whether or not that project was successful or not, was a couple of sort of observations really about the distribution of academic work, about what it might mean to be a wandering academic. So let me just talk about these three sort of ideas. So first of all, space. One of the most obvious things for me was that I was spending a great deal of time outside what you might call my comfort zone. I remember having a meeting with a Black woman activist for a local organization who was clearly very suspicious of this white man from a university, saying, can I help? Come along, can I help? And she said, where would you like to meet? And oh no, she said something like, where would you like to meet? Would you like to meet up at the university, or will you come down to us? Yeah, something along those lines. And obviously that was a test. So we met in Hamilton House, some of you will know, ex-squatted social centre down in Bristol. And I still remember kind of that meeting and coming down, and I was I kind of felt kind of naked in a sense, that I didn't have all my props around me. I didn't have all my books. I wasn't in my office. I didn't have the authority of the university cloaking me in the way that it normally does. And we had a fascinating conversation about a whole variety of different things, sitting on mismatched chairs from, some abandoned school, and posters for endless lost causes and all this kind of stuff. But it kind of prefigured a whole series of the meetings I ended up having, in which it made much more sense to try to do that work outside the university. On the few occasions where I did do things within the university itself became a problem. So I remember, for example, organizing a big event on community wealth building. And it took place in some big chemistry lecture theatre. And I was chairing the thing, and we had some people talking about community wealth building, Preston model, that kind of stuff. And very rapidly, the university itself became the problem. It became the source of people's disquiet, almost as if holding it at the university made the university into the issue, not community wealth building. And obviously the university was part of the issue, because you can describe universities as anchor institutions and all that kind of stuff. But it was almost like it was harder for people to see the topic because they were at the university. And a whole bunch of other ways too, in which the space of the university just became harder and harder for me to occupy. So things like, for example, I was trying to help a small anarchist group, left-wing group, do some use some university rooms for a reading group, and you'd have thought that really wouldn't be that hard. But after this person had asked me, can we just get a room every Wednesday night from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock or something like that, and I sort of blithely promised that wouldn't be a problem at all. But in the end, it ended up to be effectively impossible, because I had to say who they were and, you know, whether or not there was some kind of danger from these people being present, and they would have had to pay for porterage to make sure that the buildings were secure and locked down at night and all that kind of stuff. So it basically became impossible for me to even be the conduit for a bit of space at the university. It'd be much easier for them to go to the, you know, a room above a pub or something like that than to use all of these empty rooms, which were just up the way, empty rooms which are supposedly dedicated to knowledge. So space was a really interesting issue. The second other interesting issue for me was time. In some odd ways, something about the way that the times of the university sometimes just didn't synchronize with the times of the activists I was talking to. So the most common way in which that happened was we'd be talking about a particular kind of project, and they would say, well, you know, can we meet again about this next week? And then you'll have got some funding secured by then, right? They kind of imagined that I was a fast Santa and that I could just produce the cash ever so quickly. And of course, as you know, most of us on this call, as I suspect, are academics. Universities just don't move like that. You know, it'd be more sensible for me to say, well, if we have a meeting about this in 3 months, then maybe I can talk about some kind of funding. But in practice, it very often meant that the university was just far too slow, far too sluggish to respond to the kind of initiatives and ideas that were being put forward by people in the city context. I mean, I can tell endless stories about this, but one of them was about trying to help somebody who was doing some stuff on employee ownership trusts. And we were trying to set up some kind of quasi-consultancy arrangement whereby he could access some expertise to look. It doesn't matter about the details, but the whole thing ended up being mired in, you know, contracts. And about nine months later, after we'd first started to talk about this, he just came back and said, "This is useless. You know, we just can't do this. We can't work with the university. The university is going through all its due diligences and purchasing policies and costing academic time and all this kind of stuff. But it all takes time. It all takes so much time." The other interesting thing about the time question, though, was that sometimes I really deliberately needed to slow down, because I think for the first 18 months of me doing this, I was really just establishing trust with a lot of people who are quite familiar with academics who come down from the hill and conduct what's usually now termed extractive research and then fuck off back up the hill and write their papers about things. So just having cups of tea with people in a kind of a fairly idle way and sharing ideas, connections, inspirations, that kind of stuff was also curiously useful. There was something about the way in which that then helped me to establish my position within a particular network by not hurrying, by not being too transactional, by not being too instrumental, and so on. So there seems to be a curious paradox in the time stuff there, in that sometimes I couldn't act fast enough, but very often I was trying to be deliberately as slow as I possibly could. So there's space, there's time. And then the third one that I want to talk about is kind of interests, I suppose. And this is something about, well, interests and capacities, perhaps. I think I used that phrase. The way that the institution sees its world and the way that the activists, social movements, and so on see their worlds. So one of the things, you know, I've been quite conscious of as some sort of organization theorist, obviously, is that universities see the world in a particular kind of way. They see research problems or grant opportunities or potential students, or maybe even empty buildings or whatever it might be, that there's a particular kind of optic. This is a bit like Mary Douglas, how institutions think. You know, how does the institution think about its environment? And to some extent, it constructs its environment based on the object of interest in it. So what counts as a research problem, for example, is framed in terms of, you know, a particular discipline or a certain way of thinking about funding, or of the kinds of people who might be enrolled in a particular kind of project, or whatever it might be. Yeah, that the research is constructed as a sort of administrative artifact that can then generate some sort of funding or whatever it might be. That's clearly not the case for the vast majority of people I was talking to. Yeah, the vast majority of people were interested in particular issues, sometimes very urgent issues, sometimes quite long-term issues. And that simply didn't mesh. Oh, have I gone strange? Can you still see me?
They'll see you.
Okay. Sorry, my computer's really messing around today. What I can see on my screen is my head just sort of jiggling around a lot. Is that not that's not what you
it's
can
glitching see? It's glitching for me as well, I can say.
It's
Yeah,
exactly what we see.
Is
The
it?
top of your head's gone all kind of pixelated,
Yeah.
and you've gone a bit max headroom, actually.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
definitely
right.
max headroom.
Going
Yeah,
back to the
thanks,
1980s.
Chris. It looks a bit like I'm thinking some really, really interesting digital thoughts. Shall I just keep talking? Because you can hear my voice, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So just in terms of meshing the interests of the people I was talking to and the interests of the university, which to some extent I was representing, and very often they were hugely mismatched, you know. So let me give you one small example. Oh, I'm back again. Let me give you one small example. So I was talking to Bristol Bike Project, who are a lovely little co-op who basically generate income by selling and mending bikes, and they have to pay the rent and pay themselves, and then they give away their profits as bikes to refugees in Bristol. And I was trying to think about, you know, how we could talk to them, how we could work with them and help them in various ways. And two things. One is the coordinator at that time basically said, I don't have any time to work with you. You know, if you can buy me out for an afternoon, then maybe we can have this conversation. But in practice, I'm too busy doing what I do right now to think about how I'm going to work with you. And I said, well, okay, what if we could, you know, get some resource to do that kind of stuff? What would you want? And her requests were actually very simple. She wanted some help with the website and some help with the accounting stuff that they do. And those were the kind of the key things that she cared about. But even then, it wasn't possible for me to get that, because to get, you know, some students to work on the website as a project effectively meant that I would have to go and talk to, well, there's a guy who does this kind of stuff in the digital engineering department, part of engineering, who does these projects on a yearly basis. So, you know, they've got great stuff, but basically you need to have a project proposal, which you send to them in about June, and then they decide whether or not to take it on. And then a group of students will take it on in about September, October, something like that, and then work on it. And then give you some sort of, you know, some piece of software or whatever it is. But it just doesn't, you know, it doesn't fit in terms of her wanting somebody doing the website tomorrow, right? You know, that's the point, that there was such asymmetry between what I could do. And I was left kind of feeling after that conversation in particular, it's a bit like a kind of an elephant trying to hold hands with a mouse, you know, when the elephant just can't even coordinate the simplest things that it could be doing for the mouse. Even though Bristol University looks like it should be gigantically useful and helpful for a variety of people in Bristol, in practice, it's incapable of doing that kind of stuff. Now, I'm going to stop in a second, but I just want to leave with some sort of questions. So I guess this talk, this paper, is about the idea of distributing the university, about what it might mean for the university to occupy different times and spaces. And the title comes from some work from the States, the idea of the university without walls, of kind of spreading the university around, making it into something that's less intramural and more extramural. That's something that I feel really positive about for a whole variety of reasons that we can discuss in a bit. But I also just want to say something about the dangers of that, because there is something about the idea of the university which may require a certain kind of concentration and slowness and disconnection. That sometimes when I think about some of the good stuff I think that universities do, that this is almost like a practice that feels quite, and I'm very uncertain about these kind of arguments, so, you know, let's discuss them, please, that feels quite monastic that feels like it's quite separated from the world that it's part of. And even though I am very keen on distributing what we do, on doing a variety of different projects in a variety of different ways, on ideas about co-production, engagement, and civic, and all this kind of stuff. At the same time, I worry about what that might mean if we lose the idea of the university in doing that. If the university almost becomes indistinguishable from its context. And I do think there's something about a particular kind of separation that might be necessary in order to preserve the idea of the university. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That was probably fine. I can send you the PowerPoints if you're interested. But yeah, questions and stuff. Do you want to share this, Steve, or should I just pick people when they put their hands up, or what?
I guess I'll share it, and I'll do the horrible thing of asking a thing first because I can. And the first thing I would want to ask is, you started with your dad, and this sort of earlier point of extramural education and workers' education. And I'm sort of curious that as universities try to be impactful or outward facing in these different ways, has there been any efforts which sort of look back to these earlier models of going outside the walls? Because I mean, I don't know if your dad's experience of that relationship would have been sort of as complicated or as fraught as you're describing the differences in time and space and mismatches, but it seemed to me that maybe those could have been earlier other ways of relating the inside and outside of the university, which might have at least sidestepped some of those problems.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And I just don't know enough about the histories of extramural stuff in this country or others, and organizations, engaged in what you might broadly call workers' inquiry, like the Workers' Education Association and so on, which I think was affiliated to trade unions and so on. It'd be really nice to know some more about that kind of, I think, a largely forgotten history in a sense, because in this country, it's very difficult to imagine that universities would just give their sweeties away for free now. You pay for us, and you pay handsomely for us. So the idea that some of us would just go out and do a class in some local library about critical management studies or something is almost preposterous. It's almost laughable, isn't it? But it would be really nice to understand a bit more about what the conditions of possibility for that earlier settlement was, because my understanding is that as part of the university block grant, all of the old universities had some kind of extramural department, and it was seen as being, I'm not sure if it was mandated, but it was seen as being part of their responsibility to be providing adult education in the areas that they were located in. And I beyond that, I don't know. I mean, maybe somebody on this call knows a bit more about that stuff than. Oh yeah, and there's the extension movement as well. Yeah. So this was, sorry, Christopher's just put that in. So this was a kind of an earlier phase of this, where you had some of the older civics. Bristol did this as well, basically setting up almost kind of mini satellite campuses. And some of this stuff is quite radical. Some of it is really just sort of trying to make sure that the working classes wash a bit more than they did at present. They did then, but some of it's quite radical. There was an university settlement in a part of Bristol called Barton Hill, in the early years of the 20th century, which was pretty radical, really, with a whole bunch of university staff who were reaching out, if you'll excuse the rather patronizing implications of that metaphor, to the working classes in East Bristol.
I will attempt to chair a discussion. I see Phil's hand go up. Phil.
Hello. Thanks, Martin. All the usual. Really enjoyed that. I was hoping at some point you were going to play a Depeche Mode video for us, though. It was a bit of a flashback to the 80s with your Max Headroom thing, but. Two things, something brings back things to mind. I remember when I was at Glasgow Caledonian, and we got a new vice chancellor or director, whatever he was called there, and he came to one of our meetings, and he, we become a university and all that sort of the post-92 thing. And I remember him coming to the meeting and saying, look, this is ridiculous. You can't, we were sociology as well, which was perceived to be something of an outlier. And, he made the comment about, look, this cannot be a contemplative institution. We're over the road from the bus station and down the road from the gang warfare, which was one of those comments that actually put a lot of people on the back foot, because on the one hand, we all had an ambition to engage outside the walls of the institution. We wanted to be more, what's the opposite, apostolic or whatever it was, kind of place. But at the same time, so many of our academic identities, particularly my colleagues, I was quite new to the institution, were based on this idea of being scholars, of being distanced. But I think your point you're making about the dangers of this course is, there's an awful lot tied up with, within the academic community to be the kind of the Mannheimian free-floating intellectuals. And I think that's a real thing that we need to get over. And I think that's a real struggle. The other thing I was going to come to was, going back to this idea of when I was at Glasgow Caledonian, your narrative, I think it certainly resonates with me when I try to work with organizations outside the university, but it is also coming from a very privileged institution. And I'm wondering whether or not that's the experience of colleagues who are working, in, say, the post-92 sector, who are still working in further education, where that kind of outreach still is part of the mission of those institutions and not just wrapped up in sort of abstract notions of impact or whatever. So that's just a question. And the other thing was just a very quick one. You talk a lot about, of course, the kind of the operational issues about getting rooms and funding and all those
stuff. Yeah.
Are you making a case, perhaps in some respects, for a greater sort of, input of the private sector into higher education, if we really want that? Because the private sector is much better, as we know, most of the time, not all of the time, of being responsive in this way, because we are large, lumbering, bureaucratic, quasi-public state institutions. So again, I just wonder if there's another danger there, actually, part of the answer to this might be, well, actually, what we need to do is act more like, small private entrepreneurial organizations rather than the kind of the nurturing safe spaces for critical intellectual thought that we like to think we are.
Yeah. They're really interesting observations as ever. I think so. In terms of the kind of eliteness of Bristol, it's sort of interesting that the whole civic university thing kicks off at Newcastle and then is picked up by a bunch of the big Russell Group civics. That whole civic discourse is getting used in other places too, after all. I was talking to the local water company, and they like the idea of reinventing themselves as civic too. There's a certain sort of idea about responsibility or something like that, which is being invoked there clearly. I don't know enough about how the ex-poly sector that I used to work in too is now responding to these kinds of questions. There is clearly a sense that some of the, according to the league tables, weakest universities in the country are ones that are most fully engaged with their publics, with their local and regional publics. But I don't know how powerful that engagement is. I don't know what it actually means. So, if you talk about, for example, the place that I did my PhD, Staffordshire University, which was then North Staffs Polytechnic, that basically taught students from Staffordshire and the counties round about. It was already a fairly regional institution. It didn't have particularly strong connections to a variety of if you like, of civil society in Stoke-on-Trent and Stafford, and in some ways was a remarkably impervious institution, I think. Now, I've heard of late that that Staffordshire University is becoming much more interested in styling itself as a local regional institution and so on. Right. But this is an institution that's so hamstrung now. It's continually making waves of redundancies, can barely afford to heat its buildings, etc., that I'm not sure what significance those gestures have. That they having Staffordshire University on your side might not be a great help, I guess is what I'm saying. But secondly, in terms of the market stuff, well, that's the danger, isn't it? Now, I'm not saying that, you know, the market is the answer or something like that. You know, bureaucracy is the problem and market is the answer. And part of what I do want to suggest is something about preserving a particular idea of the university, a certain kind of imperviousness to space and time and interests, a particular place where certain kinds of people can gather for a while and think about certain sorts of things. And that seems to me exactly the opposite of the imperatives of the market. The question, though, is who gets in, right? You know, who gets in and where does it happen? And I don't see any particular reason why it can't, those sorts of practices can't be more distributed across particular sorts of spaces and times of certain cities and city regions. I still remember when I first read Alvin Toffler's Future Shock. I'd moved to Stoke-on-Trent by that point. And in Future Shock, Toffler talks about this experimental design for a moving university based on the old loop line in Stoke-on-Trent. And it was basically going to be a university in railway carriages that they pushed around the city to, you know, so wherever you needed some classical education or whatever it might be. And I still think that was just kind of marvelous. That's sort of lovely. The idea of this sort of caravan of universities wandering around the potteries or something like that. So no, I don't think the market is the answer, because that sets up some sort of glib opposition between, you know, slow bureaucrats and fast markets or something like that. I don't think that's the thing that I'm primarily concerned with here.
Yeah. No, thanks. I didn't think you were, but yes, thanks.
Yeah.
For the answer.
Yeah.
I guess Magda.
Hey, Magda.
Hey, thanks very much. This was really thought-provoking.
Pleasure.
My background is I'm doing feminist organization research, and it's not directly linked to academia, but there is some overlapping history because I'm looking at an organization which is a library, feminist library. So it's got a lot of historical links to the to women's studies in particular. So I'm thinking about those and how contextual they were, you know, at the time when a lot of those same women were involved in those extramural education systems or setups. It was linked to the fact that there were no women's studies or very few women's studies courses at the time at universities. So it was a kind of intervention. So it was very much of its time, even though you could argue it's still relevant in some sense. So I'm wondering how much of it, you know, is still relevant now, and how realistic is it to think of it really as a civic initiative? Because so much of what we talk about, right, in academia nowadays as impact should be connected to what we're talking about now, but isn't really, because it's all about how highly we're ranked in journals, really, at the end of the day. So yeah, that was a bit of a ramble, but I hope it makes sense as a question.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, I think there's a series of almost kind of scales at which I could try to approach that question, Magda. One of them, in terms of the final things that you were saying, were really about the kind of the incentive structures for academics, right? And there is no particular reason why we can't build in ideas about whatever you want to call it, engagement, impact, citizenship, or something like that. And indeed, many universities are now. So we can incentivize these kinds of activities, just as, you know, the publication of 4-star F bollocks has been incentivized in, you know, in promotion and appointment documentations and all the rest of it. That's a kind of bureaucratic question. Still leaves open that question of what sort of impact and engagement academics might be encouraged to be participating in. The more managerial question for me is something about the legitimacy of universities themselves within their city regions. So places like Newcastle, Sheffield, Bristol, and so on are interesting, in part because these are medium-sized cities with now gigantic, usually at least two gigantic universities within them. And those are institutions that are becoming increasingly subject to a kind of political friction, if you like. So Bristol, for example, and this is not unusual in terms of cities like the ones I've already mentioned, is generally seen to be a problem for the city. So, you know, so is UE, because we've now got something like in excess of 60,000 students in a core city population of about 470,000 people, something like that. So during term time, 1 in 10 of the city's population are students, and that's having a catastrophic impact on housing, on the distribution of businesses, on the emptying of the city in the summer, etc., etc. It really is impacting, and you know, the mayor has tried to make some direct interventions in this area, obviously, because city councils are rarely happy with people who aren't paying full council tax for a variety of fairly obvious reasons. So I think that the universities, the leaders of universities are increasingly having to get to grips with the kind of political economy and geography of the regions that they are dumping all these students in. Remarkably, our new Vice-Chancellor, Evelyn Welsh, who's, by the way, Florence Welsh's mum, yeah, that's Florence and the Machine Welsh, by the way, she recently made a claim about growing the University of Bristol from 30,000 to 50,000 students. And where the fuck are these kids going to go? You know, it's just not possible. But there is, at the moment, there is no mechanism that can prevent that kind of lunatic decision making. Yeah. And I think that's the case in general. So universities do have a problem, and they need to solve it with some version of political CSR, I think. So talking about the ways in which universities could be useful then becomes a kind of a political solution. It allows them to talk to the city council and local businesses and third sector organizations and community groups in ways that might actually end up being quite productive, even though it comes from quite a venal place. I don't know if that was it was a kind of an attempt to talk around your question, Magda, I think.
I suppose Christopher?
Thank you.
Doesn't that dog need walking, Christopher?
Yeah, no, I'm going to take her out in a minute. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I just, I'm loving this. It's great. So thank you very much. It's really
Pleasure.
fascinating stuff. So I'm a PhD student at Essex, and my research, well, I study universities and what we call widening participation.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm looking at widening participation as an industry. So a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, I find really fascinating. Particularly around this idea of space, and I'm wondering, can we expand? Can we reach the outside of university from the inside of university? And the reason I'm saying that is because just from my own journey. So I basically joined Essex as a security guard many years ago without any A levels, and basically just met loads of people and became inspired to study. So then I started with the Open University originally, got enough credits to come back and do an undergrad. So I'm just wondering, is there space within universities for outreach for staff? So how do we promote or support staff education from within, bearing in mind that many staff members from campus-based universities working in trades, etc., are generally from the local area. So you're meeting that civic engagement by utilizing that the staff base, basically. So yeah,
absolutely. So two thoughts. One is that very often at Bristol, and I suspect at other places, that civic engagement is spoken of as if it were about academics. Yeah, and I think that's a massive mistake, and we can learn a lot from Preston model community wealth building stuff in this regard, because universities don't just have an impact on their local areas because of the research that academics do. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different, as you say, different trades, different experiences, different connections, different purchasing links, etc., with the city via non-academic staff, but also through the whole variety of different ways in which students are engaging with cities, both, you know, good and less good, let's say. So I think that we mean, you know, if we're going to talk about ideas about the civic and engagement, then we need to include all of the university and not just, you know, its not just its most senior and privileged staff, academic staff. The other part of this that I really haven't got a good answer to yet is about the sort of metaphors of reaching out, about this idea of the university. When I was writing some of this stuff initially, I was sort of talking a lot, using what I was calling tentacular sort of metaphors, as if the university was sort of reaching out like a friend, like the big friendly giant, and holding hands with all these tiny people down the hill, you know, that sort of idea. And there is something about that metaphor that just doesn't work. That all it ends up doing is producing another kind of outside, when actually, I mean, you think about this in terms of almost like sort of the topology of surfaces or something like that, then presumably what we actually want to do is produce either more porous surfaces, so, you know, more transactions between the environment and so on, all this kind of, you know, between the institution and the environment, or almost kind of imagining colonies. And you know, that in itself is quite a difficult word, isn't it? But sort of, you know, different bits of the university that might crop up in different parts of the city for a variety of different reasons, and maybe could be time limited in themselves. That seems to me more productive than simply thinking about sort of reaching out from within. Yeah, when I've been we got a very good Pro Vice Chancellor research at the moment, and I've been talking to him a bit about this stuff and trying to kind of suggest that effectively what you need to do is to be creating, okay, I think core business at the university is going to carry on as normal, right? But what might be interesting is almost like what some people have called skunk works, almost like sort of experimental semi-university, semi-city council, whatever, I don't know where else might be involved, but that are loosely connected to the university and have a different kind of shape and size and time and distribution, if you like, than the university itself. Almost like, and you know, I hesitate to use these kinds of well-worn words, but like sort of boundary institutions to the main institution that can do that kind of work of translation and maybe moving a bit faster or moving in different ways, and not necessarily having to report back to the central institution in ways that effectively end up being mimetic. Yeah, something like that. Sorry, all I've done is just sort of.
No, it's good. It's interesting. I mean, I was just thinking, you know, for staff who might want to engage with, say, for example, philosophy or history. You know, if you could get time out of if you're working in the mechanics workshop, and your boss is going to give you a day off during the week to go and do some lectures, you know, that's a great way to celebrate knowledge and for the university's civic purpose, I think.
I mean, I agree completely. I mean, the other bit of this, I spent quite a lot of time talking to people in purchasing and estates and things like that, in order to kind of talk to them about community wealth building, Preston model type ideas. And, you know, that in a sense, they're just as important, if not more important than you know, some academic like me wittering on at events like this.
But no, thank you very much. I should probably go because I've got this other meeting at 1.
All right, okay. Have a nice walk. Lovely to meet you.
It won't be long. Excuse me. It won't be long, but yeah, thank you guys. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, see ya.
Take care.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Melissa?
Are we okay for time?
I'm all right. Yeah.
I think so. But obviously, if people have to go, they have to go. So
yeah. I've only got soup. I've only got soup for my dinner, so it can wait. I'll
make it super quick. It was just following on from what Chris
super quick, like what you did there,
and your response to it. Yeah. I was thinking that, you know, some of these questions we can only really start to address them when we start to think in a slightly more creative way about how we understand knowledge. You know, what it is, who it belongs to, what we do with it, what it's for, etc. Because you're talking largely about a shift from a very proprietary notion of knowledge to something much more relational.
Yeah.
And I think until we start to think about knowledge in that way, these kinds of questions, you know, they just remain quite abstract, really. And then a slightly sort of related question was, we've talked, I think, almost exclusively about universities, but there are lots of other sectors of work and settings in which this sort of community engagement, social action is going on. And it struck me that the theatre is an obvious sort of comparator, where actually funding cuts in the 80s and 90s meant that community engagement programs, you know, almost petered out. But now the funding models that are coming through the arts councils almost have sort of expectations or conditions built into them that there will be really substantial programs that involve kind of community action, workshop initiatives, etc., etc. So I just think that that might be an interesting area to look at, where you can get ideas about how things could potentially be done differently and are being done differently.
Yeah, that a great question. So thinking about the first bit of it, absolutely. I was having a long conversation with, I've got 2 PhD students working on this kind of stuff at the moment, and we were talking a lot yesterday in the supervision session about, if you like, the kind of politics of epistemology. So essentially what kind of norms and values might be driving the evaluation of particular kinds of knowledge as opposed to others. So I think there's some pretty tricky issues behind all this. They're not tricky, they're not that new, in the sense that people like Freire and Illich and McLaren and others have talked about these kinds of things, and how we might think about what knowing means and why certain forms of knowing get validated more than others and so on. But nonetheless, they need to be foregrounded. On the kind of the sort of building in impact and engagement in theatres thing, one of the curious tensions I've seen is that a lot of the really big, so Bristol gets buckets of cash for research grants and stuff. It's really effective at hoovering all these things up. And I'm involved in 2 big multi-partner bids. Doesn't matter about the details of them particularly, but these are both mega bids, millions of quids, and all of them involve working with a whole variety of different partners, some corporate, some third sector, etc. And the university is finding it very hard to catch up with that, actually. It's odd that some of the biggest grants that it's getting, particularly those that involve social scientists, which both of these ones do, obviously, are prefiguring a rather different way of thinking about the distributions of knowledge and power. But in both cases, particularly with one of them, the university has tried to adopt its traditional proprietorial model and then kind of failed. Because the beast that it's now tasked with delivering is so complicated and distributed and tentacular, in a sense, that it really doesn't have the systems to keep up with it, or even the infrastructure to keep up with it. So it might be that the research councils, both of these are kind of big UK type research bids, that the research councils are a bit ahead of the universities in this regard, in terms of thinking about the way in which, and the terms are a bit Weasley, engagement gets built in, something like that. Does that help?
Yeah, and it kind of takes you right back to, I think, Stephen's point at the beginning about your reply to his question about what is critical management studies. Like, well, make it what you want it to be then. That model's not working, so
I guess it was. That's right. I mean, as you know, I've been concerned for quite a long time about how critical management studies, whatever that is, pays out all the theory that it's been spewing out for the last 20 or 30 years. What do we actually do? That kind of stuff. And I suppose I was kind of clutching in the waning years of my career at the idea that I could become this sort of wandering academic who is going to be going to Bristol Bike Project and finding them some cash or some students to do some interesting things, that this was going to be the kind of payoff, only to find out, surprise, surprise, that institutions / organizations are much more complicated. They don't necessarily let you do this kind of stuff easily. What a moron.
I love the idea that they won't even give you a parking space for your caravan with your bike strapped to the side.
That's right. Sad, isn't it? And talk about paying people. I've got ridiculous stories about, say, getting some activists to do some teaching on some course, only to find out there is no budget, no way of doing this without filling in 150,000 forms and data, all this kind of stuff, just to get them paid 100 quid for doing a lecture for me. It's insane, absolutely insane. Anyway, yes, I'm sure you all knew this.
Maybe what we can do is we can sort of call it end to the formal bit, and we can keep chatting to people who want to keep chatting with Martin, as long as Martin is willing to be kept from your soup for a few more minutes. Okay. I think we'll do that then. I'll press stop recording.
Okay.